The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss with another lesson about Mahler's Adagietto from his Fifth Symphony. In the first Mahler orchestration lesson, we explored various aspects of Mahler's approach to string scoring, along with a few words about the question of tempo in this traditionally stretched out work. We also did some guided score reading from the opening through to bar 32, which in a work this slow is quite a distance. Now we're going to finish that process by going all the way to the last bar. But first, let's address a couple of topics I left out in Lesson 1. As you've noticed all along, I'm sure, the harp plays a key role in establishing the dreamy, unfolding character of this musical love poem. Let's explore why its simple part is so effective. I'd say that the main reason is that it does exactly what it needs to do without drawing too much attention to itself. Mahler has done the best thing a composer can do when scoring a prominent harp part, and that is to establish an approach and compose along those lines. Here that approach is well defined, measured arpeggiation that often leads into a coming bar or into the middle of a bar. These arpeggios sometimes float upward or downward from a rest on the first or third beat of a bar, adding to the feeling of suspenseful bliss. But when they do start on a strong beat, a bottom note might blend beautifully with the extremely soft pizzicato double basses. Very seldom does the harp play a simple rolled chord or an isolated note, and it never gets any melodic duties or high filigree. In fact, it rarely reaches above the treble staff, and when it does, it only reaches the first A. What about balance and texture? Well, those elements are also strikingly effective because once again Mahler is scoring to the strengths as well as the subtleties. When the string section is playing very smooth, long lines with little attack to speak of, then the lower register of the harp is at an advantage. It stands out without much effort by the player. In fact, the lower strings of the harp have an unusual beauty and strength, which composers often neglect in favor of higher, more tinkly playing. Or they bury those humming, resonant low strings with a lot of loud scoring by trombones and bassoons. In Mahler's Adagietto, we can hear that range clearly, not just the plucking part of each note, but also its hanging resonance that subsides so gracefully into the softness of the string section texture. When the ambiguity of certain harmonic gestures is added, such as the opening thirds, which might express the bottom of an A minor triad, or the top of an F major triad, then the harp's role is complete in both helping establish the harmony and gently pacing each bar. That's not to say that this part is necessarily easy to play for the concert harpist. While it's technically a breeze, the player must carefully watch the slightest rhythmic nuance of the conductor in every bar to ensure that the arpeggios stretch effortlessly along with the shaping of the tempo. This can actually be quite tricky depending on the conductor, who might suggest rather than clearly indicate the degree of rubato. If you listen to some classic recordings carefully along to the score, you'll hear that the harpist may be off considerably from time to time due to guessing where the conductor is going. Then again, these errors in mind reading are rarely fatal to a performance, as they merely add to the sense of ambiguity rather than standing out as clunkers. One more topic before rolling out the score, I promise. But it's quite important. I strongly recommend that score readers use this opportunity to brush up on their German musical terms, especially if they want to go on to study larger and larger works by Mahler and other composers who use them freely. Some of these should be learned so they're as familiar as Italian terms, such as breiter Strich, or broader bow strokes, essentially tenuto. Another common term is mit Empfindung, or with emotion, espressivo. Other terms are worth noting because they're more or less trademarks of Mahler's approach. Viel Bogen wechseln instructs string players to use a lot of bow with many changes of direction on a held note, which results in a heavy, fierce tone. I've linked a couple of glossaries of terms from Mahler symphonies in the description, along with a spoof dictionary that often gets passed around during rehearsals for a laugh. And with that, we're ready to take on the second half of this movement. We left off at the bottom of page 179 of the revised Peters edition, in which the second violins take over the melody. As I noted in passing in the last video, the seconds get a generous share of melodic duties in this movement, which is a great way to use a resource of talent that's often sidelined. The second violins are sometimes positioned with their instruments facing away from the audience, or buried behind the first, and these differences of location can contribute to a distinct variation of sound. Here in the score, to add to these distinctions, is the marking Griffbrett, the equivalent of sul tasto, or playing with the bow over the fingerboard for a chestier, more heartfelt sound. Note once again in the next system how the cellos and violas cross lines, with violas dipping below cellos twice, and then becoming the middle voice between divisi cellos at rehearsal mark 2. Interestingly, the upper cellos are doubled by the seconds for a very full tone here. But since the other voices are mostly playing on lower, fatter strings, the balance isn't thrown off by this thickening, especially in light of the first violins playing a very rich sul G. As the passage continues, look for how Mahler plays with all these approaches, even having the violas digging away at an open string double stop below unison cellos. One last note before we have a listen. The grace notes in the first violin part in bars 43 and 44. These are ingeniously scored to the natural tuning of the violin, making it simple for the players to hit an open note and then add the fingering on the same string in a higher position, daisy chaining their way down the instrument. This is part of the reason for the marking D Seite, or sul D. Mahler is warning the players to break the chain here and not end up extremely high on the G string. The sudden forte piano ending of the passage takes us to a modulation to G-flat major. The easy open-string resonance of F major is curtailed for a denser, more controlled and intimate sound, in which nearly every tone must be fingered, except for the occasional B double flat, which even Mahler scores as an N-harmonic A natural for the firsts on a grace note. Even so, the seconds would still most likely finger the B double flat below on the D string rather than playing it open, to get more life into the note. As always, keep your eyes on the violas, how they double the seconds at the key change, then cross over them to track the firsts below at a tenth before dipping back again. As the melody rises higher and higher in the firsts, the violas become the lowest sustained voice, and then finally play intervals with the double basses under the middle voice cellos. This is somewhat tricky to tune, but wonderfully refined in tone as the violas show their affinity for the double basses in such close combinations. Note the frequent changes of key signature that signal an eventual return to the original key of F major. Mahler is taking the music from G-flat major down a fifth, at least enharmonically, to B major, only for a few bars, and then to two sharps, which would seem to suggest D major. But even though he does everything he can to set up a perfect cadence at the end of the passage, he pulls away at the last minute and deposits us back in F major by bar 72. It's a masterful act of harmonic evasion. Orchestra players don't actually need the marking of so many changes of key signature, especially when the original key is only one flat. There are far more tortuous passages of modulation in some symphonic scores with no change of key signature, that any accomplished contract player would be expected to take in stride. But the underlining of the changes, especially D major here, plays with the musician's expectations in a delightful way, as with the score reader as well. As always, watch for crossings on the scoring as well, with the violas often playing between the divided cellos, or even serving as the lowest voice here or there. I love how the double basses fade into nothingness at the end of bar 71, going into the transition back to F major, to have their resolution taken over by a 6/4 chord on the harp. One last word here before we have a listen. Notice that the harp has been completely absent since the modulation to G-flat major. This is strategic in several ways. First and most practical, it relieves the harpist from having to do a lot of quick retuning from 1 flat to 6, and then to 4 sharps, and so on. Second, it allows the music to develop in a different direction, with less suspense and more deliberation. And then finally, on the transition back to F, the harp returns the music to a sense of harmonic ambiguity for the recap. Mahler thinks of every detail. That takes us to the recapitulation, but it's no copy and paste job. The melody is given to the second rather than the first violins, and subtly changed here and there, as if the initial dreaming of the opening has been changed by the music trying to remember where it started. The cello's answering melody is also altered into an encapsulation of its original arc, which sets up the final push for the first violins. As the passage progresses, the cellos reach all the way up to A above middle C. This could have been scored in tenor clef or even treble, but here's a place where psychology works with scoring. The extra ledger lines underline the sense of soaring, at times even as high as the first violins. Speaking of those firsts, look how they push down with tenuto accents at the end of bar 83, only to spring up into the stratosphere in the next bar, taking the seconds right along with them. At this point, the violins and cellos are playing a triple octave A, with the viola sawing away at the bottom of an augmented C-sharp chord, then D minor. The bar ends in an amazing way. The violas are in the middle with the cellos on top and the seconds below. Then these two opposing poles arpeggiate across each other to underline the destination of an F major 6/4 chord. But the most masterful stroke here is compositional rather than orchestrational. The piece avoids the emphatic resolution of a triumphant, fulfilling perfect cadence, and instead very slowly works its way down through a series of rather evasive suspensions. It ends as ambiguously and dreamily as it started, except with just enough of a final tonic resolution to signal completion. This series of lessons will take a break during the upcoming massive open online orchestration course, then return in October with a special feature on Rachmaninoff. Thanks so much for all the really positive feedback and likes you gave me for the first Mahler lesson. I'll return to Mahler again in 2017 with a few lessons deconstructing his more massive, cinematic-sounding scores. I hope you'll stick with me until then, and in the meantime study these 2 lessons for the upcoming MOOOC Term 1 this summer. See you soon.